Keeping the real Reformation alive, one topic at a time. Doth protest, doth protest,
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Doth Protest, a podcast stuck in the 16th century. Kidding. It's a podcast on Reformation history and theology and how the 16th century can inform and inspire us today here in the 21st century. I am Reverend Andrew Christensen. Glad to be back with y'all. My co-host, Reverend James Rickenbaker, is here as well. And in today's episode, we will be discussing the 16th century, which is not unusual for this show. But what is unique about this episode is that we're bringing on a special guest to talk about a work of historical fiction. So, Amy Mantravadi joins us today to discuss her new book, which will be the first of two books of historical fiction set in the Reformation time. It's titled Broken Bonds. It is a novel with the main characters being Martin Luther, Erasmus of Rotterdam, and Philip Melanchthon. Um, I want to share a couple of praises said about the book, which I actually just got from the back cover of the book, and you don't even need to own the book because you can go on Amazon, look at the back cover. But I very much echo what these two people have to say about it. First, David Zoll, co-founder of Mockingbird Ministry and previous guest on this podcast, said this of the Broken Bonds novel. It's historical fiction of the highest order, jammed with excitement and grit and detail, yet with a depth of theological understanding the genre almost never possesses. And then also theologian Reverend Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson, also a friend of the show, and her father Paul Hinlicky, says Amy Mantravadi has taken one of the most consequential yet inaccessible controversies of the Reformation over the freedom of or bondage of the will and rendered it into living color, three-dimensional depth, and an emotional charge that grabs you by the throat. I had a very similar experience reading this book. Amy, welcome to our podcast. Thank you for being on.
Thank you so much, Drew and James. And I will do my best to be succinct with my answers today so that no one can accuse the lady of doth protesting too much. So,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, that's funny. It's the first time a guest has ever referred to the title of the podcast, which I don't know.
Yeah.
I just chose it and I guess it stuck. So I thought before, like, should I rename this? Because there's other creative puns and stuff. But we're keeping it. Doth protest. And a little about yourself, Amy. I first encountered your work. You're a pretty regular over at 1517 because you're a pretty regular contributor there at 1517.org. And you have a little bio there that reads you live in Ohio, which I'm sorry to hear, with your husband Jai and your son Thomas. And I'm kidding, by the way. I'm from Michigan, so I have to. It's the obligatory thing.
Yeah.
I lived in Ohio for 2 years for seminary. So no.
Well, I grew up in Michigan, so
Oh, there
we
you go.
we both had it covered for both sides.
Okay. Um, you hold a bachelor's degree in biblical literature and political science from Taylor University and an MA in international security from King's College London. And you've written several books along with articles we can read from you at 1517.org. Now, I'm curious, and you probably didn't think I was going to ask you this, the graduate degree in international security, what
Mm.
prompted that? It seems like you have some broad interests, and again, I mean no offense about Ohio. So, but yeah, international security.
Yeah, well, none taken. It's hardly the worst dig I've heard at Ohio in my day. But, God has mercy on us here in Ohio, and we're incredibly grateful for that. But in terms of international security, this is sort of like a Luther-esque situation in that my career was going in one direction and the Lord kind of pulled me in the other direction. Or like Calvin, both Luther and Calvin kind of had a legal-ish background in their
Right.
studies and then switched over to the theology. So you saw that when I was a my undergrad, I had a double major in biblical literature and political science. But I thought the biblical literature major was the just for fun major, like the personal betterment major.
Mm.
And I wasn't thinking of that as a career path. But what happened was, I ended up, I went and did that degree in international security. I was very interested in that, got a job working in Washington, D.C. Then I met someone who was in the Air Force and married him. And the Air Force just sends you wherever they want, even if there are no jobs in international security there. So that seemed like sort of a disappointing thing that my career in international relations sort of died at that point. But you know what? The Lord knew better, because there is not a day that goes by now that I say, oh, I am so glad I am not working in politics. Because I mean, God bless all the, there are good Christians working in politics and they're trying to make the world a better place. And that's great. But I know that my stress level could
Yeah.
not handle the current political situation. So the Lord was very gracious in bringing me into using that time of kind of not knowing what to do in my life and bringing me to a course on the history of the Reformation that I listened to and got very interested in that. And through some friends that I had, encouraged me to start writing in the theological mode. I'd been doing writing before, but more in the political mode.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has just been a process over the last decade or so of the Lord kind of showing me that actually this is what he wants me to be doing. But you know what? That education in politics and just learning how human beings work in political affairs was so instrumental to me in the way I approach everything now, because I had been coming from this background where I had this sort of, you might say, higher view of human nature, or what David Zoll, who you mentioned, would call a high anthropology.
Yes.
Like, I thought, not that I didn't think human beings were sinners, but, I thought we had free will, and I thought, we could kind of make the right decisions if we have all the right resources. And 4 years of working on, specifically the area I was focused on was the Middle East. And, one of the most intractable situations in the world. 4 years of working on the Middle East convinced me of the bondage of the will. And because I could see, or even just, in US politics, that actually we don't have the power to be righteous in and of ourselves. And so that was part of several different things that kind of coalesced at that point in my life and discovering a deeper understanding of Reformation theology being at the heart of that. These things that were happening in my life just brought me to this greater realization of what God does for us in salvation, that God is the one working in us when we do good works. And right. Not that I had no understanding of that before, because of course I was reading the Bible and it's there in the Bible, but somehow it hadn't all sunk down, and it hadn't sunk down to the level of giving me that assurance of salvation that I feel like I now have. Not that I never have doubts, but a high anthropology makes it very hard for you to just rest in what God has done for you, because you feel like there's always something you have to be doing. Right. So coming into this low anthropology sort of paradoxically makes me feel so much better about myself and about God and about everything. So yeah. That explains the change of career direction.
Yeah.
You just summed up David Zoll's book, Low Anthropology, too, by the way, which is a great way of describing the human condition. And actually, I have a very similar, people on the podcast have heard, I have a very similar realization in my life. 4 years of, it wasn't working with 4 years in the Middle East, but it was 4 years of parish ministry.
That'll do it.
Yeah. And like, I love our people here. But nothing convinces you of the bondage of the will like working with people. Or as G.K. Chesterton once said, the only Christian doctrine which is empirically verifiable is original sin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
You don't have to go far to see that.
right.
What I found fascinating about your book is it centers on three important, main figures of the Reformation. I mean, Luther is as main a main figure as you can get. Um, and it focuses on two of the leaders, Luther and Melanchthon. Then the third person is, of course, as many of our listeners will know, inspired the Reformation in many ways as being a Renaissance, important humanist of the Renaissance, Erasmus, but he never did not get on board with the Reformation. Um, and Luther's been tackled in historical fiction probably before. He's been portrayed on stage, on film. He's been psychologized in many ways by modern authors. But the other two main characters here, Melanchthon and Erasmus, while historically very important, especially for people who are up on reformational stuff, they're not necessarily today household names, but they're still very important. And all three of these guys, their stories in reality were intertwined, and that lends itself, I think, to the story. The way the book goes, it kind of reminded me of the old mini-series model where, the story doesn't have one main character, but, three or four, and it jumps to each one's respective story, and then we see how their paths kind of, weave together. And this may be a silly question, but why these three? Like, I mean, Luther's obvious, but, you could have picked Zwingli, you could have picked, I don't know, an opponent like Pope Leo or the Archbishop of Mainz. I don't know, you could have picked Martin Butzer. I don't know, maybe he's not. Or, even some of the people that are minor characters in this that like Jonas or Amsdorf. They appear, but they're not main. But why were the main ones these three? I guess share why you felt it was important to have these three as the main characters for what you wrote.
Yeah, well, I am still waiting to sign that deal for the HBO miniseries. I can see it in my head, but we'll see if that ends up happening or
I was
not.
gonna
But
ask you like, are there, sorry, I know you're gonna answer this one, but I was curious, like movie and show rights. I know those are a thing. How does that work? Because I mean,
uh
I'd like to buy the movie rights to your book, but I'm a pastor with a mortgage, and so I can't. But
you know, I think you should probably just get in touch with the good people at 1517 Publishing. But honestly, probably not high potential as a film, because if you look at the kind of films that are making it big, we're really not going for quality very much here in the Western world. But as far as why I chose this story and to focus on these three men, I think it has a lot to do with my own personal journey that I mentioned. So I mentioned that I listened to that course on Reformation history, and one of the things that really caught my imagination was this debate between Luther and Erasmus. And I had known a little bit about Erasmus from the time I'd spent studying biblical literature, because Erasmus was important in the history of Bible translation.
Right.
So I knew about both of them, but I hadn't realized that they'd gotten into this, kerfuffle with each other. And the whole history of why they did is interesting. And Erasmus was very much pressured into it. But that they had this, just the personal story of their personal backgrounds and personalities coming into play beyond even just what they were arguing about, I found to be very fascinating. But also the thing that they are going back and forth about, do human beings have free will? And it really gets down to how in control is God of world events, and how in control is God of our salvation. I think, wow, I mean, what bigger question could there be to discuss? And Luther even says this at the end of his book, The Bondage of the Will, where he was responding to Erasmus's book, The Freedom of the Will. He didn't have much time for Erasmus's arguments, or even for Erasmus as the theologian, but he did say, you alone have put your finger on the crucial point, because
Right.
everyone else is bothering me about this debate about indulgences or, church councils, all these different they're important, but they're not the key thing. For Luther, the key question in theology is always, how can I be righteous before God? How do I know that I have eternal salvation? He is constantly thinking about death and eternity beyond in a way that, I mean, my theory actually is that personally Erasmus probably was thinking about that a lot, but in his writing, you just don't see that. It's about here and now on making a better world here on earth and improving behavior. And his idea of reform for the church, which he did advocate, was very much into kind of getting rid of medieval superstitions, reforming behavior of the clergy, and making a more peaceful society where we're not having these wars, where we're not having, terrible poverty. Whereas for Luther, it's not that that's not important, but there is nothing that will ever be as important as your eternal destiny. And the central fact of human existence for Luther is that every human being is going to die. We're mortal. And because we're mortal, not only are we going to die physically, but we're dead spiritually. That is the central human problem that has to be solved. So in that process of going through and reading those two books, that was how I came to embrace Luther's view, was through that process of reading those books. So this has had a big impact on me personally. And just, it's sort of an intangible thing that this is just what captured my imagination more than anything else. I loved reading about Erasmus's backstory and how, his own father couldn't acknowledge him because he was a priest. And how did that affect how he thought about God as his father, and how he thought about the fact that God chooses some people and not other people, and how that for him would always only be a negative thing. He could never see election as a source of assurance. It would always be a source of just despair. And how for Luther, that exact same doctrine was a source of joy and release. So I love that dynamic. But as I was starting to think about doing the novel, I looked at Philip Melanchthon, who kind of gets caught between the middle of these two guys, because while he very much is on board with Luther's theology, and I wouldn't want to suggest anything different, he has personal ties to Erasmus because they have a lot of the same friends. Philip Melanchthon's great uncle Reuchlin was a close friend of Erasmus, and there was this thinking from the time that Melanchthon was young. Even Erasmus was saying he's going to be the greatest scholar in Germany. He's going to be the one that helps improve society. He had all these expectations on him. And Melanchthon is very deep in the humanist movement, which you have a very educated audience, so they probably are somewhat aware of that. But for those who don't know, this is not secular humanism we have today. This is a method of academic study, which at the time was at the cutting edge of modernity, as opposed to the medieval scholastic method. And it was all about recovering ancient wisdom and translation of ancient documents and making humanity better through education. So Melanchthon has that tie, and education reform is always going to be important to Melanchthon throughout his life. So as this happens, these two people that Melanchthon cares deeply about, who have kind of been able to sort of at least tolerate or not respond to each other up till now come to this, this sort of brutal clash. And Melanchthon is really torn by that on a personal level, and particularly torn because he doesn't know, like we do, that the Reformation is going to last. And he's worried that if we make an enemy out of Erasmus, we're going to lose all these supporters who really respect Erasmus, particularly if Luther is seen to mistreat Erasmus, which is what happens. So I began to see we could have a very interesting, dramatic kind of triangle relationship there. So that was why I chose to focus on this story.
Well, I think it's a perfect three. I mean, and one thing about all three, which I think two came out in the book, is that Luther and Melanchthon and Erasmus, they have one thing in common, despite their rather very different demeanors between the three of them. They're very different temperaments between the three of them. Their difference of approach and how they tackle things. And not to mention theological differences between the three of them, is that they're still all caught up in the middle somehow. they're all caught up in the middle in a way against what they like wished for. And that's kind of their struggle. There's kind of like extremes on all sides and excesses on all sides. And they, in their own way, find themselves in the middle. And if you were to pick one of them, one might see one of the other two as being an excess in some way. But all three of them kind of see themselves as like the healthy moderates. I don't know. Like, can you kind of
Yeah.
is that what do you kind of get that feeling too from it certainly comes out in the book, I thought.
That's absolutely true. And, I'm writing these books at a time when everybody's lamenting that we're having political radicalization in the West, or just that, without trying to get too political myself here, just that people are really moving farther and farther away from each other. It's getting harder to have any kind of positive engagement,
Mm.
because everything's just kind of gotten so bitter and poisoned. And then we've got a worldwide pandemic. We've got a war on the European continent again for the first time, the first serious war since like World War II. And we've got, now war in the Middle East, of course, back to the Middle East. I thank you, God, for saving me from those 4 years. But we kind of have almost all the horsemen of the apocalypse at this point. We haven't had famine yet, but I don't know the supply chain issues. Maybe we were pretty close to that. So when I look back at this particular moment, 1524 to 25, we're seeing in the first book kind of the rumbling start, and then in the second book, the complete fruition of the German Peasants' War, which was a massive conflict at the time. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around it. But to the people who were living at that time, they were really worried that the government was going to hold together. And government then was very different than now, but basically everything was getting very anarchic. You had peasants who felt like they had been wronged for years, who started calling for, more protection of their rights, better wages, etc. And at first it was, sort of, even Luther could kind of get on board with it. But then as it goes on, it starts becoming like almost a doomsday call. You get these radical theologians, particularly Thomas Müntzer, who come in and they're basically saying the world's about to end, sell everything, let's go have a big battle. And they're telling these farmers who have nothing but their farming implements for weapons that they can stand up against these fully armed knights. And it was a bloodbath. I mean, it's estimated as many as 100,000 people died. I mean, that's an enormous amount of people at a time when populations were much lower. And this is all happening in the middle of these books. And when I looked at the circumstances of that and seeing how what had started in 1517 as the simple theological protest has now escalated to the point that society is just falling apart. And even though people think about titanic personalities like Luther or Erasmus or even Melanchthon, that they are driving events, they did not feel that way at all. They feel like they're just at the mercy of events.
They were being
like,
driven by things they didn't want.
yes.
Yeah. That's
And
kind of
every
like
day
the
they're
ministry in
just,
many ways.
yeah.
uh, I shouldn't say that, but
So,
yeah, I
yeah.
was going to say Munster. It's funny because Munster, you brought up my least favorite theologian of all time, Thomas Munster. He lived at the same time as my favorite theologian of all time, Martin Luther. So that's what an exciting century. So, um, sorry,
Yeah.
James, were you going to say something?
Obviously, this whole era is just utterly fascinating, and I wasn't thinking quite about the connections between our current situation in life and the Reformation. But what does actually make a good bit of sense is that one of the things that Drew and I have talked about online and offline is that during the pandemic, there was actually, I think, a resurgence of Reformation preaching and of Reformation theology. And one of the things that, I was thinking about was when you can't have do-goodism, like going out and helping people because being around people is actually the threat. Like you actually have to depend more on God's grace for for everything that you need. And so, like, sermons could no longer be about, like, you need to be going out and helping the poor. If people wanted to continue with moralism, they just said you need to be wearing masks. But, like, I'm starting to ramble, but basically what I'm getting at is I think it's a very interesting connection to draw between the situation in life in a very tumultuous Reformation Europe and our situation in life today. I think that's cool.
I found the book difficult to put down at many points. I mean, it's a it's an enjoyable read. It was a refreshing read for me too, because during seminary and for several years after, all I was reading was theology. Not novels about people that touch on theology, but just theology or church history. And I sort of burnt myself out on that. And but I've always loved history and the story of people. And so, I still, you know, I just always read nonfiction. I'm always in the nonfiction realm of things. I like fiction. I'm not anti-fiction, but it's not my go-to. So this is the first novel that I've read in a while. Something about the book, as I was about two-thirds of the way through, I thought, and this isn't a criticism. I thought this is a sad book, or the people are often in a sad situation or a sad state of mind or spirit, and you do take a hard look at suffering in it, and maybe and that's and from what I've gathered, because I've listened to a couple of your interviews for this book already, part of the meaning of the title is refers to the pain of broken relationships which happen. But
Mhm.
so I know, obviously, I know you're certainly not arguing that the Reformation is a sad thing, or that in a sense it's a regrettable thing. Um, but you focus so much on the pain that it caused. Why? I mean, why is that important? Because in the eyes and ears of some, that might make the Reformation look like this dark, regrettable chapter. But you find the importance of focusing on the pain it caused. And I guess, yeah, why?
Because it really has to do with how I see the Christian life. And I think how Martin Luther saw the Christian life. For most of Christian history, when people would write saints' lives or hagiographies, you might have some kind of initial moral difficulty or conundrum, but then you kind of get over that, and then it's a constant increasing in sanctification, becoming so holy that you're almost not a thing of this world anymore.
Mhm.
And it's like you don't even feel suffering anymore. It's just a pleasure to you when you
Mhm.
can suffer. Luther is going to come out with this understanding of suffering that really gets into the psychological aspect of wrestling with God. He's going to talk about what he'll title Anfechtungen, which are trials, temptations. You get different translations of it. But basically, he's going to see this as a major part of the Christian life, that actually you're not always moving from strength to strength, that actually the person who's doing things right is going to be attacked by the devil. And the devil is always there in Luther's theology. He takes the devil seriously, and he takes evil seriously. And I at this point in my life, at age 38, I've lived long enough to experience a lot of things and say, you know what? That's correct. Because we'd like to think that the Christian life is going to be all moving from strength to strength. But actually, there are things we don't understand. There are times where, right now I have an aunt who she has spent years leading this charity where she goes all around the world and digs wells for people who don't have access to clean water, and they share the gospel, and tons of people have come to faith, and it's just been wonderful. But now she has stage 4 cancer. Well, why would God give her stage 4 cancer and not, I don't know, Vladimir Putin, whichever terrible, tyrant you want to think of? It doesn't make sense. And there are going to be a lot of times in life, Luther, even after he had his evangelical breakthrough, he still went through times of very serious depression. And the point is that the Christian life is really not so much about us getting stronger and stronger and being able to cut up the mind until we're so powerful we can just, knock anything out. It's like Jacob, who spends the whole night wrestling with God, just like beating against him, only to find out in the morning that he never had any power at all, and that the whole time God was just holding him. And that's actually what faith is. It's not about us being so strong that we're holding on and we're able to grasp it. It's God holding on to us. And I'm not setting out to make people feel negatively about the Reformation, but I think if we have this idea that it was just this glorious time when everybody was happy and everything was right with the world, we're going to have a hard time feeling any commonality between ourselves and those people, because we're right now in real life and we know that things are difficult and we can't see the end of the line and everything feels very contingent, and we know God has promised us it's going to work out in the end, but in the moment it doesn't always feel like that. And we don't understand why our faith journey, we're having these times where it's like 2 steps forward but then a step back. Why is that happening? And I think really digging into the psychology and even the physicality of these characters and what it means to be a human living in a body that can get sick and that can have pain and how that affects you psychologically, it's all tied together and giving us this idea of the Christian life, that it is fraught with difficulties and trials and temptations, but does have that ultimate victory in the end. And that's why, even though there is a lot of darkness in the books, I try to give that hope of ultimate resurrection and reconciliation. And I've experienced in my life, I've again lived long enough to have some broken relationships and see churches fall apart and see all kinds of things happen in that regard. And I don't know if there will ever be reconciliation in this life, but what gives me hope is that I know that there will be at the end of time. And the Christian life for Luther is always about hanging on to that promise that God has given you, and not judging based on how things are looking in your present circumstances, because that's the theology of glory. The theology of the cross is knowing that God's glory is displayed in suffering and clinging to his promise of resurrection. Yeah. So that's what I hope to bring through in these books. And the two of them, when they're together, I hope will give that entire arc. Obviously, because we have a sequel, we left things a little bit not completely fixed at this point in the story. And, I'll be honest, they're not going to be completely fixed at the end of book 2 either, because the remainder of these guys' lives wasn't a picnic either. But I think hopefully that ultimate message of redemption and reconciliation will come through. And I think that's something that, for me as a person, it's more encouraging to me, actually, that to see that people are, they're going through the same stuff that I am, but yet they're having hope through that, and hope isn't based on how nice our present circumstances are. So hopefully that comes through.
Yeah. But there's also, with that though, there's a lot of humor in the book too. I found myself laughing out loud at some points. Is it right if I share an excerpt from it's about when it's about astrology? Do you remember what?
Yes, yes.
So
by all means,
Luther and Melanchthon are walking somewhere, and our listeners probably should know astrology was like not astronomy. Astrology was considered like a serious science back in the 16th century. Melanchthon studied it. He was all about it. And I'm going to share this quote. You set too much store by the stars when you ought to confess the sovereignty of God, Martin asserts. Phillips has heard this complaint before, and he cannot account for it. Every scholar of the natural sciences has respect for the astrological method. The sun governs the times and the seasons. The moon governs the tides. Why then is it so hard to believe that the stars have some purpose of their own? The two are not in conflict, Philip explains. Scripture tells us that God created the stars as guiding lights. They declare his glory day by day. Even so, they speak to us now, warning of evils and calling us to repentance. Martin shakes his head. But who can interpret their speech? He asks. These prophecies are either so vague as to be of no use at all, or they predict things which never come to pass. That is the very definition of false prophecy. Philip then takes a deep breath. It is he who devoted much study to this topic, not Martin, whose opinion is more likely to be correct. He feels the need to defend himself as much as the discipline. He says, they do not declare what will come to pass. They warn of what might come to pass if we ignore them. We are not bound by the stars, but called by them to a higher purpose. Again, Martin shakes his head. It still seems like a load of shit to me. I love that. That made me laugh out
And
loud.
shout out to 1517 for letting me maintain Luther's original language in the books.
Well,
Now,
I
having
don't know
said
the
that,
German word for that, but I know I've read it at one point. It's not, I have a big thing of German flashcards. That's not one of them. But I'm gonna have to put an E for
yeah.
explicit on this episode. So
Well, and to be honestly, there's not much language in the book, but it's really hard. You want to give an idea of what these people were really like.
yeah.
Luther talks about excrement a lot.
Oh
I
yes.
mean, he uses as a metaphor a lot, and he uses excrement related exclamations. Now, there is some question of the best way to translate this into English, but I just found that if you like use the word poop or crap or something,
Yeah.
it just doesn't
Yeah.
right give you the right
This
idea.
this
And
isn't
I've
Veggie
heard,
Tales. Yeah. And even
yeah,
they wouldn't go as far to even say that. But yeah, no, this is about adults. It's about real people who have real struggles and have real dialogue. So yeah, I get it. I totally get it. Sorry, you were going on about that, but
no,
um,
it's okay. I'm glad you enjoyed
oh, I
that
love that.
scene.
I read the part
I
the night.
enjoyed as an author the little irony of Philip saying, I'm the one who studied this. Who's more likely to be true? Of course, we sit here in the 21st century think you're the one who's off base about
Yeah,
the
right.
astrology thing. But isn't that the way we always think, though? Because we think, oh, well, I've studied this. So obviously, and we'll have some person who's never read anything about it come up and give some opinion. And of course, we think we must be right because we're the one who's actually researched it, right? But sometimes you're still wrong. So, yeah.
Love that part. But so on kind of back to the back to the sadness and the struggling and the suffering. A lot of the book is inner dialogue. Like obviously there's external dialogue. I just read from, quotation marks of it. And took some liberties to say Martin then said Philip when I read through that just
Yeah.
so the listener can follow. So there's external dialogue, but there's a lot of internal dialogue. And like novels or like novels do. There's a lot of inner dialogue for all three main people. And through this inner dialogue we get, I think, a deeper look into them. And I really enjoyed how you weaved the inner and external dialogues, kind of in that example I just gave. Uh, Especially the part, and I don't want to spoil too much. Gosh, the part where Melanchthon uh, proposes to Catherine, whose last name was Crap. I know that this excrement keeps coming
Yeah.
up on this show, but that part where he proposes to her, oh my gosh, I felt like I mean, it was very much like a romance novel at that point, but I was like, man, you know, I was, on a human level, I was like, wow, it was very effective. Um, but anyways, like you also use the inner dialogue to teach, theology to the reader in a very accessible way, um, that is tied to the concrete situation that one of these three guys is in, or it's tied to the relationships one of these three guys has, and how do they work out their principles, their feelings, their convictions within these situations and relationships, like real people do. I thought it was so well done. But and this kind of goes back to Erasmus. Um, the inner dialogue, the inner contemplation, we get to see the inside of their minds. But of the three people, I suppose toward the end of the book, the person I was still, and maybe this will come out more in book two, the person I was still unclear about what exactly was it that was troubling them so much because it was kind of ambiguous was Erasmus. And I don't mean that as a criticism, but there's you allude to things that he broods over or worries over, but for me, it's not as clear cut as the other two, like what his aims are, what his convictions are, and I don't know, maybe that's intentional too, because he was, as Luther would accuse him of possessing no convictions, anyways. So, and you mentioned the predestination part earlier. I guess can you explain how do you see how did you see Erasmus? Um, how did this? Can you elaborate more on how was this predestination thing a thorn in his side? Was he trying to evade it? Was he trying to get away from it? I don't, can you kind of, I don't know, tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my theory in, crafting this story is that people don't come to theological opinions simply because they've used their reason to rationally select what has the best amount of evidence. That actually we as human beings on our gut level are driven by desires. And our reason is certainly involved. We can, especially with sanctification, we can find ways to overcome or redirect our desires. But that ultimately, my theory is that the way that Luther and Erasmus were arguing in this debate for or against free will was ultimately about what they wanted to be true.
Mhm.
And I think that's true for most of us, that what happens, as much as being rationally convinced of a theological point, we actually have a change in what we want, and that God brings that about. But Erasmus, when you read his letters and look at his life story, you see he's such a doubled individual,
Mhm.
because he's always trying to run away from his past, because he was born illegitimate, and that in that day and age meant there were all kinds you couldn't have benefices from the church, there were all kinds of problems that this would cause for you, and it's just embarrassing. And he ends up being this great scholar who's like sitting and dining with kings, but he was born in poverty and illegitimacy and comes basically from nothing. So he's always running from his past. And there's also this question, which I get into a little in the book, and I kind of take an opinion, but scholars are debating whether or not he had some kind of romantic relationship with this other monk when he was in the monastery. So there's that question, and I was very interested to zero in on that, because we do not have, I think, a more uh a bigger debate at the moment in our society about whether or not human beings can choose things than with sexuality and gender. We are having this debate. Are you born one way and that's just the way you are? Or can you make a choice and change? And what are the legal implications of that? And what are the theological implications of that? So, given that this what is legitimately something in Erasmus's history that we have record of, I thought how interesting to sort of zero in on that as something that would make him think about free will, and to zero in on the relationship with his father as to make him think about what does it mean for God to be my father, and how would those two things come and get together to affect how he thinks about predestination. But and some of that, I'm taking some artistic liberties because I
Mhm.
can't know for sure. I wasn't able to get him for an interview for this book, so you want to be careful. Like if I was writing a history book, just nonfiction, I would not want to be psychologizing as much. But when you're writing a novel, you have to make a choice. You can't say, well, maybe Erasmus did this and maybe he didn't. You just have to make a choice and go with it, because that's how stories work. But if you even read, I read, a few biographies of Erasmus, read scholarly literature about him, and everyone who studies him says he seems to be very internally conflicted. He seems to be, yeah, like there's the Erasmus who we see in his published writings, who's like very serene and feeling very assured about the way the world is going. And then you read his letters and he's like panicking. He's like constantly telling people the world's going to hell in a handbasket. And there's almost this element of the doth protest too much, and that he's always telling people in his letters, oh, I'm very certain of my eternal fate and I have no worries about, yeah, I'm a sinner, but I have no worries about where I stand before God. He says this so often that you almost feel like, okay, we're hitting a sensitive spot here. So I think you probably came away with the correct interpretation of the book, that he is very conflicted.
Yeah.
He's not entirely sure what his motivation should be, because he's had this idea that he's finding his meaning and his identity in this push for better behavior and better education. And just at the time when people have more educational resources than ever in human history, they're behaving worse than they ever have. And it's just all falling apart. And he's like, I don't understand. This is what I believed, what I've been pushing for, but I look out my window and it's not happening. And so I do think you'll see that, maybe some more resolution on that in book 2. But sadly for Erasmus as a person, I don't know that he ever got resolution on that. He was kind of really struggling all the way to the end, if you look at his letters, and he died really an unhappy person, which is tragic. I just feel for him as a person. I want him to be able to have that moment where he really gets it and he gets that freedom in Christ. But that was something he always really struggled with. So I think although Luther and Melanchthon certainly have their struggles and their doubts, they both are much more set on what their end purpose is, especially Luther. So I'm not surprised that you took that away from the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's intentionally left ambiguous because I think, he doesn't really know his convictions fully. And when you don't know that, you can't really name what you're conflicted about as specifically as someone who has clear aims, I guess. That I don't know. I mean, I guess that's kind of how I kind of piece it together. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Erasmus
so
is always for sure such an interesting character. And I loved reading Bondage of the Will and seeing the interactions between Luther and Erasmus. And one of my favorite ones was that one of the biggest complaints that Erasmus had about Luther's response was that it was so long. But it's, as you rightly pointed out, because Luther said that Erasmus hit the nail on the head. But what you were just saying about, you wished that Erasmus had that moment where he discovered freedom in Christ. The fascinating thing is that he believed that he had freedom the whole time, and that was what kept him in bondage. That's and that's the paradox of the Christian life, is that realizing that we are bound, we end up becoming free in Christ. But thinking that we're free, like so many people today in our society do, we realize just how bound we are.
and that
I
comes
think
up in the
that's
book.
yeah.
No, sorry, Amy. I say Amy points that out, and I remember a few times where in his Erasmus's inner dialogue, he says, "I'm free, I'm free." And why does he think this? Because well, he's bettered himself for some way, or he's helped open the world up to betterment, but that's not actually what gives freedom.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just the contrast between his public statements and then what you read in his letters.
Yeah.
And this is, and I think we fool ourselves a lot. We tell ourselves what we want to be true. And we tell ourselves, yeah, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. And yet when you look at how we're constantly afraid and anxious and, all these things going wrong. And so with Erasmus, I think what you see happening is this sort of discontinuity between what he's declaring and the symptoms that are presenting. So,
Yeah.
and it's this process of him having to realize the symptoms that are presenting are sort of maybe suggestive that actually things are not as okay as I think they are. But Yeah, that's the way it is for so many people. And I mean, honestly, we all fall back into that way of thinking all the time. So we constantly need God to remind us of what true freedom is, because we think true freedom is when we have maximum agency, maximum number of choices. And even we see this in society today, that in America, freedom means you can just choose from as many things at the grocery store as you want. But sometimes there are forms of freedom that are actually bondage. And so I even try to get into that in the book, like, what is freedom exactly? What kind of freedom are we talking about?
Yeah. And I wonder if when they write biographies about us 100, 200, 300, so on years from now, are they going to be looking, we don't really write letters. They can be looking at our emails. Because I'm starting to go self-conscious. Like, am I a different person on my emails than my email, my mass emails or my one-on-one emails? God, I wonder how they're going to write biographies about people in the future, because that is,
Probably fortunate that most of us will never have a biographer.
Yes.
Yeah.
that probably
Never make
is.
too big a splash. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't need to be scrutinized or, whatever. I'm fine with not having someone. I'm fine with not being the center of attention in that way. So, uh, kind of before we close, I wanted to get kind of a nerd time, if you will. Some people that are pretty obscure come up in this, like Veit Dietrich. When I saw his name, I was like, that sounds familiar. Oh yeah, because if you look at table talks, I think it's table talks, maybe some lectures in Luther's works. It's not like Luther was writing those necessarily. They were transcribed. He was saying them, and someone transcribed them, wrote them down. I remember in my in my academic work having to cite Veit Dietrich's transcriptions, and I'm like, I don't know anything
Mm-hmm.
really about him. I think I wikied him and saw he was, a student of Luther or whatever. But you pick up on this stuff. You like put in names like this. So obviously you spend a lot of time in the sources and in the research. And I'm kind of curious. I know you put footnotes in there, but it's like a novelist doesn't have to cite all the time. I mean, that would just kind of be weird. And I mean, you see that in nonfiction reference, whatever. But in your book, you make footnotes for interesting things, like an expression or something that when you kind of allude to, I think it was something in Spain was happening that most people wouldn't just know about. So you put a footnote in there about that, but it's clear, like you're putting in these names and things like only someone who's really done a lot of research would know. So I'm just kind of my nerd questioning part. I know we got to wrap up soon, but like, what kind of things were you reading for this? And
Yeah, well, you do kind of get a little bit in my strategy with this book, because my goal is that this is someone who would never pick up and read The Bondage of the Will, who that's just, too intense for them, would be able to read this. I wanted to make sure the bar to entry, so to speak, was not too high,
Yeah.
so that someone who doesn't know much about the Reformation could read this and understand that. And that means that in general, I'm trying to keep the number of characters a little smaller, so there are fewer people to keep track of. But there are also moments where, I'll give a footnote for, if anyone's interested, or to help people. Some of them are to help people understand. But there are some Easter eggs in there for people who are
yeah.
really into the Reformation. I'll just give you one little example. There's the scene where they're all in church and Melanchthon has to step out during the sermon. And there's this little throwaway line that he accidentally steps on Amsdorf's toes on the way out. Well, a few decades later, they're going to be like at fisticuffs, the two of them. And Amsdorf's going to be part of the Genesio, what becomes the Genesio Lutheran party. And so, it's not like one of them goes into heresy, but they're gonna have some objections, some personal objections to each other. So that's just a little, for someone who really is reading a lot, they'll be like, oh, that's kind of funny. But most of the time we try to keep it a little simple. But in terms of what I read, I mean, my greatest limitation is my lack of fluency in German and Latin. Now I do some studying of the German language. I've made even some more progress since I wrote these books, but it was enough to help me with my research. But I definitely am taking advantage of new technological tools that are helping me to search and translate and do things like that. But probably for all three men, I read 2 or 3 biographies. And then I stopped reading biographies because they start repeating a lot of the same stuff and start diving more into the theological and philosophical stuff. And there was the element of, wanting to get the history right. So researching what people were eating, what their buildings were like, what, I designed, I had a map of both main cities and drew where everything would have been at the time as opposed to where it is now. Things like that. But also I had some theological points I wanted to make. So doing theological reading and even just a lot of reading in scripture and coming together with, these are the verses that I want to reference at different points. I had a long list of verses to use, and these are the points that I really want to get across, and this is how I should express that. So it was a pretty intense research, but it wasn't like I did 10 years of nonstop research. It was several years of when I had time digging into it, and then when it came time to write, a few months of really intense reading. And then at a certain point, you just have to get started writing because you could research forever. And there's only the point of the novel is not to show off how much research you've done, because then you end up with all this unnecessary exposition, which is why I did some just in footnotes, because it would just weigh down the story if you have that much explanation. But as I'm going through, every time getting ready to write a new scene, even, doing a little more research again, and even after I've written them through the editing process, I keep reading, and there are things that I'm like, oh, got to go back and change that. I just had one for book 2. We're finalizing that, and I realized I had gotten something wrong, so we're going back and changing it, and it's a continual process right until they're actually printed and distributed.
In your acknowledgments at the end of the book, I enjoyed reading that because I'm like, it's always cool to see who was helpful, who inspired, who walked with this person during this process of, the research, telling the story. But you did, you talked about earlier looking at maps. Did you actually, from what I take it, your acknowledgments seem to suggest you actually took a trip there to get the
I
layout.
did,
And
yes.
Robert Kolb was I know he was in Germany for the path. He's back, I think, in the States, but he was in Germany for a couple years. I had him as a
He goes
past
back and
instructor.
forth kind of
Yeah.
seasonally at this point, and maybe because of COVID and other things, there have been some times where he's maybe stayed in one place for longer. But I think typically he's in Germany during the summer. He's doing research, and he teaches a class at the Luther Institute in Wittenberg, and then he's teaching a course or two still at Concordia St. Louis.
Mhm.
So, but I'll just show you. Unfortunately, your listeners can't hear it, but this is a photo that Dr. Robert Kolb took of my husband and I sitting on Martin and Katie Luther's seats outside the front door of their house. And I wasn't sure if it was legal for us to sit on them, but there was no one around except for Dr. Kolb. And I figured, if anyone can give me permission to sit on Martin Luther's seat, it's Robert Kolb. I mean, never mind what these people working in the gift shop think, So I turned to him and I said, do you think we could sit there? And he says, well, I don't think anyone's going to stop you. So he took that photo. And so Robert Kolb, enterprising photographer. If you need any family portraits taken, he'll be on hand.
Yeah.
So that was very incredible. He and his wife are just so sweet. And I mean, the thing about Kolb, everyone respects his scholarship. But then when you talk to the people who know him, they have such wonderful things to say about him as a person. And that's not necessarily true for every scholar out there. So And he really pours into students. And, I wasn't actually his student, but it's kind of that dynamic.
Yeah.
I'm a person who's learning from his wisdom. So that was wonderful. And yes, I'm very grateful to all the people in the acknowledgement section. And next time, maybe for book 2, I'll do a list of the people who didn't help me with the book, and then we can call them out on that. But
Yeah.
this time we'll go nice.
Well, you can we didn't really help you with book 2, so you can put us in that disacknowledgement section if you want. So
Well, I think you're being very kind in reading my book and having me on your show. And this has been a wonderful discussion.
this has been a wonderful discussion, and I'm very grateful, thankful you could come on, Amy. That's a good segue to wrap up. Thank you again. I'll put a link in the show notes. I feel like that's a comment. I always say that on the show. I'll put a link in the show notes. I'll put a link in the show notes. You could have not a drinking game, but a good Christian game where you have to do something every time I say that. But yes.
Oh, we're talking about Luther. It can be a drinking game.
Fair enough. Get a good German beer. But yes, I will have a link for the show notes to this book for people to purchase, available ebook or paperback or hardcover, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, I'll have a link, and I encourage, and hopefully this episode has given some excitement about and furthered your interest if you already had heard about it and have not gotten around to reading it yet. It's a great novel, and it's a great, brings to life these 3 people and other people in it as well. So thank you, Amy. God bless. God bless James. And listeners, we'll see you next time.